Commander Jake Miller stood in the main corridor of the research vessel, Aurora, and watched the three Zephyrian aliens examine their equipment with what could only be described as smug satisfaction. The tall crystalline beings moved with fluid grace as their translucent skin caught the ship's lighting and created rainbow patterns across the metal walls. Captain Vextile was the tallest of the three aliens, and his voice carried a musical quality that somehow managed to sound condescending. Even when he was being polite, the Aurora was humanity's newest diplomatic vessel and this mission to explore the planet. Kepler 442c represented the first joint archaeological expedition between humans and Zephyrians. Jake had spent months preparing for this assignment, and he knew how important it was for future relations between their species. The Zephyrians were an advanced civilization with technology that made human equipment look primitive by comparison. And they never let anyone forget it. Science Officer Morden activated a scanning device that hummed with energy and projected a three-dimensional hologram of the planet's surface into the air between them. The detail was incredible, and Jake could see individual rock formations and what appeared to be ancient structures scattered across the landscape. Engineer Kelmer manipulated the display with graceful hand movements and zoomed in on various locations while making notes on a device that seemed to respond to his thoughts rather than physical input. Jake watched Lisa Park enter the equipment bay carrying her standard survival pack, and he noticed the slight pause in the Zephyrian conversation as they observed her preparations. Lisa was one of the most experienced archaeologists in the human fleet, and her practical approach to field work had saved countless expeditions from disaster. She moved efficiently through her checklist, and Jake could see her methodically organizing her gear with the precision that came from years of experience. The three Zephyrians stopped their work and focused their attention on Lisa as she pulled out what appeared to be a simple handheld mirror and carefully wrapped it in protective cloth before placing it in her pack. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, and Jake could sense the shift in the aliens' mood as they exchanged glances that somehow conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. Captain Vextile was the first to speak, and his melodic voice carried a note of barely concealed amusement as he addressed Lisa directly. He asked why she was bringing what appeared to be a vanity object on a scientific expedition, and suggested that such primitive items had no place on a serious archaeological mission. His tone was polite, but there was no mistaking the condescension behind his words. Morden joined the conversation and pointed out that the Zephyrians had advanced scanning equipment that could analyze any surface or material with perfect accuracy. He wondered aloud why humans would waste valuable pack space on something so technologically backward when superior alternatives were readily available. His criticism was delivered with the kind of scientific detachment that somehow made it more insulting than direct mockery would have been. Lisa maintained her composure and explained that mirrors had multiple practical applications in fieldwork, including signaling, starting fires, examining hard-to-reach spaces, and providing backup communication options when electronic systems failed. She spoke calmly and professionally, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders as she continued packing her equipment. Kelmer laughed with a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and suggested that human attachment to primitive tools was evidence of their species' inability to fully embrace technological advancement. He demonstrated his own equipment, which included force field generators, advanced communication devices, and environmental protection systems that could adapt to any planetary conditions. The contrast between his sleek alien technology and Lisa's simple mirror was obvious and apparently amusing to all three. Zephyrian aliens continued their commentary as Lisa finished her preparations, and Jake found himself growing irritated with their superior attitude. The Zephyrians had certainly mastered impressive technology, but their dismissive treatment of human methods showed a lack of respect that troubled him. He had read reports about previous joint missions where similar tensions had created problems, and he hoped this expedition would be different. Lisa ignored the continued comments about human primitiveness and focused on her final equipment checks. She examined her mirror one more time, and Jake noticed how she held it with the careful attention of someone who understood its value beyond the obvious. There was something in her expression that suggested she knew things about survival that The aliens with all their advanced technology might not appreciate Captain Vextall approached Jake and expressed concern about the mission's success, given what he called the human tendency to rely on outdated methods. He suggested that perhaps humans should simply observe while the Zephyrians conducted the actual archaeological work using their superior equipment and techniques. His offer was presented as helpful cooperation, but Jake recognized it as another example of alien condescension. Jake responded diplomatically that the mission parameters called for full cooperation between both species and that human experience in archaeological fieldwork would be valuable regardless of the equipment used. He pointed out that Lisa had successfully completed dozens of similar expeditions, and her practical approach had often solved problems that high technology could not address. The conversation was interrupted by the ship's communication system announcing their approach to Kepler 442c and the need for all team members to report to the briefing room. Jake watched as the Zephyrians gathered their impressive array of equipment while Lisa shouldered her simple pack with its controversial mirror. The contrast between their approaches to the mission was striking, and Jake wondered which philosophy would prove more effective on an unknown world. As they moved toward the briefing room, Jake noticed that Lisa walked with the confident stride of someone who had faced unknown dangers before and survived through skill and preparation. The Zephyrians moved with the elegant grace of beings who had never doubted their technological superiority. The coming mission would test both approaches, and Jake suspected that the planet below would provide challenges that none of them fully anticipated. The Aurora continued its approach to Kepler 442c while the joint expedition team prepared for what would become a lesson in the value of simple solutions and human ingenuity. The Zephyrians' mockery of Lisa's mirror would soon be replaced by desperate gratitude as their advanced technology failed them in ways they never imagined possible. The shuttle descended through the atmosphere of Kepler 442c, and Jake Miller pressed his face against the viewport to get his first clear look at their destination. The planet was unlike anything he had seen before, with vast regions of different climates separated by sharp geographical boundaries that seemed to follow no natural pattern. Captain Tom Bradley piloted the shuttle with steady hands while calling out readings from his instruments that confirmed what their orbital scans had already revealed. Archaeological site lay in a temperate valley surrounded by what appeared to be perfectly preserved ancient structures, made from materials that gleamed like polished metal in the light from the planet's twin stars. The Zephyrians had chosen this location based on energy readings that suggested advanced technology might still be functional after thousands of years. As they approached the landing zone, Lisa Park studied the terrain through her own viewport and made notes about the unusual reflective properties of the ancient buildings. Captain Vextall activated his scanning equipment and immediately began collecting data about atmospheric conditions, geological composition, and electromagnetic readings from the ruins below. His instruments painted a detailed picture of their landing site and confirmed that the air was breathable for both humans and Zephyrians. Morden added his own scientific observations and noted that the planet's twin star system created unique lighting conditions that would require careful timing for their surface operations. The shuttle touched down on a flat area near the largest of the ancient structures, and the team began preparing for their first excursion onto the planet's surface. Lisa checked her equipment one final time, and Jake noticed that she spent extra attention examining her mirror before carefully placing it in an easily accessible pocket of her survival suit. The Zephyrians were busy calibrating their advanced instruments and seemed confident that their technology would make short work of any mysteries. The ruins might contain engineer Kelmer made another comment about human attachment to primitive tools as he observed Lisa's final preparations and suggested that she would have more pack space for useful equipment if she left the mirror behind. His tone was lighter than before, but the condescension was still obvious, and Jake saw Lisa's jaw tighten slightly as she ignored the comment and continued her work. The team exited the shuttle and stepped onto the surface of Kepler 442c for the first time. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth normal, and the air had a crisp quality that made breathing feel effortless. The ancient structures rose around them like monuments to some long-dead civilization, and their reflective surfaces created a dazzling display as light from both stars struck them at different angles. Lisa immediately began examining the closest building and ran her hands along walls that felt warm to the touch despite being in shadow. She called Jake's attention to the way the structures seemed to be positioned to catch and redirect sunlight in specific patterns, and suggested that the reflective properties might have served a functional rather than decorative purpose. Her observation was based on years of archaeological experience and her understanding of how ancient peoples adapted to their environments. Captain Vextal overheard her comments and activated his own scanning equipment to analyze the building materials. His instruments provided detailed molecular analysis within seconds, and he announced that the reflective properties were simply a byproduct of the manufacturing process used by the ancient civilization. He dismissed Lisa's functional theory as typical human tendency to assign practical purposes to aesthetic choices. The Zephyrians spread out through the ruins with their advanced sensors and communication devices, working in perfect coordination. They could share data instantly across their network, and their analysis capabilities far exceeded anything humans had developed. Morden discovered what appeared to be a central control chamber, and his readings suggested that some systems might still be operational after millennia of abandonment. Lisa worked more slowly but with equal thoroughness as she examined the ruins, with careful attention to details that might not show up on electronic scans. She used her mirror to direct sunlight into shadowed corners and examine surfaces that were difficult to reach. When she needed to signal Tom Bradley in the shuttle, she simply angled the mirror to catch sunlight and flashed a message that he acknowledged. Immediately Keller noticed her signaling technique and commented that such primitive communication methods were unnecessary when they had advanced devices that could transmit detailed information across vast distances. He demonstrated his own communication system by sending a complex data stream to the shuttle that included three-dimensional images and complete atmospheric readings. The display was impressive and made Lisa's simple light signals look crude. By comparison, the exploration continued for several hours as both teams documented their findings using their respective methods. The Zephyrians accumulated massive amounts of data about the ruins' construction, age, and probable purpose, while Lisa made careful observations about how the structures related to their environment and the daily patterns of the twin stars overhead. As the morning progressed, Jake noticed that the temperature was rising more rapidly than their initial atmospheric readings had predicted. Tom Bradley's voice crackled over their communication system with news that orbital sensors were detecting unusual electromagnetic activity building in the upper atmosphere. The twin stars were beginning to align in a configuration that occurred only rarely and would create dangerous conditions on the planet's surface. Captain Vextal consulted his instruments and confirmed that they were experiencing the beginning of what the Zephyrians called a stellar convergence event. His calculations showed that they had approximately 6 hours before the electromagnetic effects would become severe enough to interfere with their equipment, and the temperature would rise to levels that could be dangerous for both species. The team decided to continue their work, but with increased urgency as they raced against time to complete their survey. Before conditions became too hazardous, the Zephyrians pushed their scanning equipment to maximum capacity and began downloading everything they could about the ruins' construction and purpose. Their technology was working flawlessly, and they expressed confidence that they would complete their mission successfully. Lisa continued her methodical examination of the structures, but Jake could see that she was paying increasing attention to the way sunlight moved across the reflective surfaces as the twin stars changed position in the sky. She seemed to be developing a theory about the building's design that went beyond their obvious archaeological value, but she kept her observations to herself as the Zephyrians dismissed her previous suggestions. The electromagnetic buildup was subtle at first, but Tom Bradley reported that his navigation systems were beginning to show minor fluctuations that suggested the predicted interference was starting earlier than expected. The shuttle's advanced sensors were still functioning normally, but he recommended that the surface team begin preparing for emergency evacuation procedures. If conditions deteriorated rapidly, the ancient ruins seemed to respond to the changing stellar alignment as their reflective surfaces began creating more complex patterns of light and shadow. Lisa watched these changes with growing interest, while the Zephyrians focused on collecting data before their scanning window closed. Neither team realized that they were about to face a crisis that would test their equipment, their assumptions, and their ability to work together when survival depended on setting aside their differences. The first sign of trouble came when Morden's scanning equipment began producing inconsistent readings that flickered between normal values and complete static. He tapped the device with one crystalline finger and frowned as the holographic display wavered like heat mirages rising from hot pavement. The electromagnetic interference that Tom Bradley had detected from orbit was beginning to affect their ground-based instruments in ways that none of the Zephyrians had anticipated. Captain Vextal consulted his own instruments and discovered that the stellar alignment was progressing faster than their calculations had predicted. The twin stars were creating electromagnetic pulses that swept across the planet's surface in regular waves, and each pulse seemed stronger than the last. His communication device crackled with static as he tried to contact the shuttle, and Jake could see concern beginning to replace the alien's usual confidence engineer. Kelmar activated his force field generator to provide protection from the increasing electromagnetic interference, but the device sputtered and produced only a weak shimmer in the air before shutting down completely. He examined the unit with growing alarm and announced that the planetary field fluctuations were overwhelming his equipment's ability to maintain stable power output. His voice carried a note of disbelief, as if the failure of Zephyrian technology was something he had never considered possible. Lisa Park continued her examination of the ancient structures, but Jake noticed that she was paying careful attention to the way the building's reflective surfaces were responding to the changing conditions. The electromagnetic pulses seemed to create patterns in the reflected light that followed the same rhythm as the stellar alignment overhead. She pulled out her mirror and used it to examine these patterns more closely while the Zephyrians struggled with their failing equipment. The temperature was rising steadily as both stars moved toward perfect alignment, and the electromagnetic storm intensified with each passing minute. Tom Bradley's voice came through their communication system in broken fragments as he reported that the shuttle's navigation systems were experiencing severe interference. He could barely maintain contact with the surface team, and his instruments were showing electromagnetic readings that exceeded all safety parameters. Captain Vextal attempted to activate his emergency communication protocols, but his advanced device produced only harsh static before its display went dark. His musical voice took on an edge of panic as he realized that their primary means of contacting the shuttle had failed just when they needed it most. He looked at his companions with an expression that Jake had never seen on a Zephyrian face before, and recognized it as the beginning of genuine fear. Morden's environmental suit began displaying warning messages as its cooling system struggled to cope with the rising temperature and electromagnetic interference. The Zephyrians' crystalline physiology made them extremely vulnerable to heat, and their skin began taking on a dull appearance as their internal temperature regulation systems were overwhelmed. His scientific instruments shut down one by one until he was left holding devices that were nothing more than expensive paperweights. Electromagnetic pulses were now strong enough to create visible distortions in the air around them, and Jake could feel the hair on his arms standing up as each wave passed over their location. The ancient ruins seemed unaffected by the interference, and their reflective surfaces continued to function perfectly while the Zephyrian technology failed in spectacular fashion. Lisa watched this contrast with growing understanding as pieces of a puzzle began falling into place in her. Minkelmar's backup power systems activated automatically as his primary equipment failed, but even these emergency measures could not cope with the intensity of the electromagnetic storm. His engineering expertise was useless when faced with planetary scale interference that his people had never encountered before. He began examining his equipment with the desperate hope of finding some way to restore functionality, but every attempt ended in failure. The heat was becoming dangerous for all of them, but the Zephyrians were suffering more severely than the humans. Their translucent skin began showing stress patterns, and their normally graceful movements became labored as their physiology struggled to cope with conditions that exceeded their biological tolerance. Captain Vextal's proud demeanor cracked as he realized that their technological superiority meant nothing when faced with forces beyond their control. Jake tried to help by offering to share his own equipment, but the Zephyrians initially refused. Human assistance with the kind of stubborn pride that put their lives at risk? They had spent so much time establishing their technological superiority that accepting help from primitive humans seemed impossible even when their survival depended on it. Their cultural conditioning made cooperation difficult even in the face of mounting crisis. Lisa attempted to signal the shuttle using her mirror, but the Zephyrians dismissed her efforts as useless given the electromagnetic interference that was blocking their advanced communication systems. They could not understand how a simple piece of reflective glass could succeed where their sophisticated technology had failed. Their scientific training had not prepared them for situations where basic physics might be more reliable than complex electronics. The stellar alignment reached a critical phase, and the electromagnetic pulses became so intense that they created aurora-like effects in the planet's atmosphere. The ancient ruins began glowing with reflected energy as their surfaces channeled and redirected the electromagnetic forces in ways that seemed almost intentional. Lisa realized that the buildings were not just archaeologically significant, but were actually functional devices designed to survive exactly the kind of stellar convergence they were experiencing. Tom Bradley's final transmission came through as broken fragments that barely conveyed his message about navigation system failure and his inability to land safely in the current electromagnetic conditions. The shuttle pilot was stranded in orbit, while the surface team faced rising temperatures and failing equipment with no apparent way to coordinate a rescue. The communication breakdown was complete, and their situation was becoming desperate with each passing minute. Captain Vextal finally abandoned his pride and asked Jake what resources the humans might have that could help them survive the crisis. His musical voice was strained with the effort of admitting that Zephyrian technology had failed them when they needed it most. He looked at Lisa's simple equipment with new eyes and began to understand that technological advancement meant nothing if it could not function when survival depended on it. The heat continued to rise, and the electromagnetic storm showed no signs of weakening as the twin stars moved toward perfect alignment. Zephyrian's sophisticated environmental suits were failing, while Lisa's basic equipment continued to function normally. Their crystalline skin was showing signs of serious thermal stress, and Jake realized that without immediate intervention, the aliens might not survive the next few hours of the stellar convergence event. Lisa Park stepped forward with her mirror in hand, announced that she might have a solution to their communication problem and possibly their heat management issues as well. The Zephyrians looked at her simple, reflective tool with skepticism, but their desperate situation left them with no choice but to listen to whatever plan the human archaeologist might propose. Their survival now depended on the very primitive technology they had been mocking since the mission began. Lisa Park held her mirror up to catch the intense light from both stars and immediately began angling it to direct the reflected beam away from Captain Vextal's failing environmental suit. The concentrated starlight that had been adding to the heat load on his equipment was redirected harmlessly toward the ancient ruins, where the reflective surfaces absorbed and channeled the energy without any apparent strain. The immediate cooling effect on the Zephyrians' equipment was small, but noticeable, and gave Lisa the confidence to expand her approach. She moved quickly between the three aliens and used her mirror to create shadowed areas by blocking direct starlight and redirecting it toward surfaces that could handle the thermal load. Her movements were precise and economical as years of field experience guided her actions. Jake Miller watched in amazement as the simple piece of reflective glass began providing relief that the Zephyrians' advanced technology could not achieve even when it had been functioning properly. The ancient structures around them seemed to respond to Lisa's efforts as their reflective surfaces began working in coordination with her mirror to create a network of light redirection that managed the intense thermal energy more effectively than any modern cooling system. She realized that the buildings had been designed specifically to survive stellar convergence events by using the same basic principles of reflection and redirection that made her simple mirror so effective. Arodin observed Lisa's technique with growing fascination as his scientific mind began to understand the elegant physics behind her approach. The mirror was not just blocking heat but was actually managing the flow of electromagnetic energy in ways that his sophisticated instruments had never been programmed to attempt. He watched her create cool zones by directing reflected light toward heat sinks, while using the same reflections to signal their location to the shuttle orbiting overhead. Lisa began flashing her mirror in the specific pattern that she had arranged with Tom Bradley before the mission began. The simple code was based on reflected sunlight pulses that could cut through electromagnetic interference because they relied on basic optics rather than electronic transmission. Each flash carried information about their location and status, while the Zephyrians' advanced communication devices remained silent and useless. Captain Vextal's crystalline skin began showing signs of recovery as Lisa's heat management technique reduced the thermal stress on his physiology. His environmental suit was still failing, but the mirror's cooling effect bought him precious time to think clearly instead of struggling simply to survive. He watched the human archaeologist work with growing respect and began to understand that her primitive tool was accomplishing things that his people's technology could not match. Tom Bradley's voice suddenly crackled through their communication system as he acknowledged Lisa's light signals and reported that he could see their location clearly despite the electromagnetic interference. His navigation systems were still compromised, but the reflected light from her mirror was providing a beacon that his instruments could track visually even when electronic guidance failed. The communication breakthrough gave the stranded team hope. For the first time since the crisis began, Lisa discovered that she could use her mirror to focus concentrated starlight onto the auxiliary power cells of the Zephyrian equipment and provide enough energy to restart some of their critical systems. The technique required careful positioning to avoid overloading the alien technology, but her understanding of basic optics allowed her to deliver exactly the right amount of focused energy to bring their life support systems back online. Engineer Kelmer watched in disbelief as his backup power indicators began showing improved readings thanks to the solar energy that Lisa was directing into his equipment. His engineering training had never included courses on primitive human tools, but he could not argue with results that were saving their lives. The mirror was providing solutions to multiple problems simultaneously, while his advanced systems remained offline and ineffective. The stellar alignment reached its peak intensity, and the electromagnetic storm created a dazzling display of energy that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Lisa used the increased light levels to enhance her signaling capabilities and began providing Tom Bradley with detailed information about their exact position and the condition of each team member. Her simple reflection technique was carrying more useful information than the Zephyrians' sophisticated data streams had ever managed. Captain Vextal found his voice and formally apologized to Lisa for dismissing her equipment and methods as primitive. His musical tone carried genuine respect as he admitted that the Zephyrians had been wrong to judge human technology by their own standards. He watched her work with the mirror and began to understand that effectiveness mattered more than complexity when survival was at stake. Morden added his own observations about the elegant simplicity of Lisa's approach and noted that her mirror was functioning as a multi-tool that could manage heat, provide communication, and power equipment using nothing more than reflected light and basic physics. His scientific curiosity was engaged as he realized that human tools might offer insights that Zephyrian technology had overlooked in its rush toward greater complexity. Lisa explained her techniques as she worked and taught the aliens how to use reflection and redirection to manage the hostile environment around them. She showed them how the ancient buildings had been designed with the same principles in mind and how the ruins were actually a sophisticated system for surviving stellar convergence events. Her archaeological expertise combined with practical knowledge to reveal the true purpose of the structures they had come to study. The Temperature began to stabilize as Lisa's heat management network reached full effectiveness, and the combined efforts of her mirror and the ancient reflective surfaces created a livable microenvironment around their location. The Zephyrians' equipment began functioning more reliably as thermal stress decreased, and Jake realized that they had survived the worst of the crisis thanks to a simple tool that the aliens had mocked as primitive vanity. Tom Bradley reported that he was beginning his descent toward their location using Lisa's reflected light signals as his primary navigation aid. His shuttle's advanced systems were still compromised by electromagnetic interference, but the basic principle of following a bright light source was working perfectly even under the most challenging conditions. The rescue that had seemed impossible was now becoming reality thanks to human ingenuity and adaptability. Asked Lisa to teach him how to use reflection techniques for emergency situations and admitted that Zephyrian engineering education had focused so heavily on advanced technology that they had never learned basic survival skills. His request marked a fundamental shift in the aliens' attitude toward human capabilities and showed that the crisis had taught them valuable lessons about the importance of simple, effective solutions. The mirror that had been the subject of ridicule at the beginning of their mission had become the key to their survival and had demonstrated that human practicality could complement Zephyrian technology in ways that neither species had previously imagined. Lisa's tool had succeeded where advanced equipment had failed, and had proven that sometimes the oldest solutions were still the most reliable when everything else broke down. Tom Bradley's shuttle descended through the electromagnetic storm, following the steady beacon of reflected light that Lisa Park maintained with her mirror despite the dangerous conditions around them. His navigation instruments were still unreliable, but the simple visual guidance system that the human archaeologist had created was working perfectly even as sophisticated electronic systems failed throughout the area. The rescue that had seemed impossible was becoming reality, thanks to basic physics and human determination. Lisa continued coordinating their evacuation by using her mirror to signal landing instructions to Tom while simultaneously managing the heat load on the failing Zephyrian equipment. Her multitasking ability impressed Captain Vextal, who watched her work with the fluid efficiency that came from years of field experience. The alien commander's crystalline features showed admiration where contempt had existed just hours earlier. As he witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of human practical thinking, the shuttle touched down safely in the designated landing zone, and Tom Bradley emerged to help with the emergency evacuation. He immediately noticed the improved condition of the Zephyrian team members and asked Lisa how she had managed to keep their equipment functioning when all electronic systems were experiencing massive interference. Her explanation about heat redirection and solar power focusing left him shaking his head in amazement at the versatility of such a simple tool. Captain Vextal was the first alien to board the shuttle, and he paused at the entrance to address Lisa directly. His musical voice carried formal tones as he offered a complete apology for the dismissive treatment that he and his companions had shown toward human methods and equipment. He admitted that Zephyrian pride had prevented them from recognizing the value of practical solutions that did not rely on advanced technology. Morden added his own scientific perspective as he explained how Lisa's mirror had demonstrated principles that Zephyrian researchers had overlooked in their focus on complex electronic solutions. He praised her understanding of basic physics and her ability to apply simple tools in creative ways that achieved results beyond what their sophisticated instruments could accomplish. His academic curiosity was clearly engaged as he considered the implications for future research. Engineer Kelmer requested permission to study Lisa's techniques more thoroughly and asked if she would be willing to demonstrate her methods for other Zephyrian technical teams. His engineering background allowed him to appreciate the elegant efficiency of her approach, and he recognized that his people could benefit from incorporating human practical thinking into their own problem-solving methods. The request represented a complete reversal of his earlier dismissive attitude. As the shuttle lifted off from the planet's surface, Lisa used her mirror one final time to observe the ancient ruins from above. The structures were still functioning perfectly as they managed the intense electromagnetic forces of the stellar convergence event, and she realized that their builders had faced the same survival challenges that her team had just overcome. The archaeological significance of their discovery would require further study, but the immediate lesson about the value of practical solutions was already clear. The flight back to the Aurora gave everyone time to reflect on what they had experienced and learned during the crisis. Jake Miller observed the changed dynamics between the human and Zephyrian team members as respectful conversation replaced the condescending attitudes that had characterized their earlier interactions. The shared danger had created bonds of mutual respect that would benefit future cooperative missions between their species. Captain Vextal spent much of the return journey asking Lisa detailed questions about human survival training and the philosophy behind carrying simple, versatile tools rather than relying entirely on advanced technology. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding how humans had developed such practical approaches to problem solving and how these methods might complement Zephyrian technological capabilities. Lisa explained that human history had taught her species that complex systems could fail at critical moments and that survival often depended on adaptability rather than sophistication. She described how human explorers had learned to carry basic tools that could serve multiple purposes and function reliably even under extreme conditions. Her explanation helped the Zephyrians understand that apparent primitiveness was actually a form of refined practical thinking. The Aurora's communication systems were functioning normally once they reached orbit, and Captain Vextal immediately began composing his mission report with recommendations for future joint expeditions. His primary suggestion was that all diplomatic teams should include both advanced alien technology and simple human tools to ensure maximum capability under any circumstances. The recommendation represented a fundamental shift in Zephyrian thinking about technological cooperation. Orden announced his intention to propose a joint research project focused on combining Zephyrian scientific capabilities with human practical problem-solving techniques. He believed that such collaboration could lead to breakthrough solutions that neither species could achieve independently. His enthusiasm for the project showed how completely his attitude toward human capabilities had changed during their brief but intense shared experience. Don Bradley added his own observations about the reliability of basic navigation techniques when advanced systems failed, and suggested that all pilots should receive training in fundamental methods that did not depend on electronic instruments. His experience during the rescue had convinced him that technological backup systems were not always sufficient. When facing truly challenging conditions, the successful completion of their mission, despite the unexpected crisis, became a model for future human-Zephyrian cooperation and demonstrated that different approaches to problem solving could be complementary rather than competitive. The archaeological data they had gathered was valuable, but the lessons about working together were even more important for ongoing diplomatic relations between their civilizations. Lisa's mirror was carefully stored in the Aurora's museum section as a symbol of the mission's success and the importance of practical thinking in extreme situations. The simple tool that had been mocked as primitive vanity had become a respected artifact that represented the value of human ingenuity and the wisdom of being prepared for any situation with versatile equipment. The final scene of their adventure took place in the Aurora's training facility, where Lisa was teaching Captain Vextal how to use a mirror for emergency signaling. The tall Zephyrian practiced the technique with careful attention to detail while expressing genuine admiration for human adaptability and survival instincts. His musical voice carried none of its earlier condescension as he worked to master what he now recognized as an important practical skill. Jake Miller watched the training session and reflected on how much their understanding of each other had improved during the brief crisis on Kepler 442c. The Zephyrians had learned to respect human practical thinking while the humans had gained appreciation for alien scientific capabilities. The combination of both approaches had saved their lives and would make future cooperation more effective and meaningful. The mission report that reached both human and Zephyrian command structures emphasized the importance of diversity in problem solving approaches and recommended that future joint expeditions should specifically include team members with different technical philosophies. The crisis had proven that apparent technological superiority meant nothing when facing challenges that required creative adaptation rather than sophisticated equipment. Lisa Park returned to her regular duties as an archaeologist, but found herself frequently requested as an advisor for diplomatic missions where her practical approach to survival and problem solving had become legendary among both human and alien personnel. Her mirror continued to travel with her on every expedition as both a useful tool and a reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective when complex systems failed. The story of their adventure spread throughout both civilizations and became a teaching example used in training programs for explorers, diplomats, and anyone who might face unexpected challenges in hostile environments. The lesson that ingenuity and adaptability could triumph over technological sophistication resonated with audiences who understood that survival often depended on practical thinking rather than advanced equipment.